I stood at the edge of the living room, fingers curled around a crystal flute of sparkling water, because even after everything, I still wanted to feel like I belonged. Around me, the Morrison family Christmas party was in full glimmering swing laughter, spilling from every corner, relatives trading tales of promotions, vacations, expensive real estate. My brother Brandon stood near the fireplace, his voice rising above the room, like always. His Rolex glinted as he casually gestured. "The merger's basically a done deal," he said. "Global Core's absorbing our division. I'm set to lead West Coast operations." There it was again. That same polished pride that had followed him since college. Varsity football, Ivy League. Our future CEO, my mom used to beam. She still did. No one asked me how I was doing until Aunt Joan, too loud and too curious, turned to me with a pitying smile. Still running that little tax thing, she asked, sweet and sharp at once. I smiled and nodded, ignoring Brandon's snort behind his tumbler of whiskey. 6 employees now, he teased. "What is it you do again, payroll for bakeries?" I wanted to laugh. I really did. Because what none of them knew, what they'd never bothered to ask, was that the CEO of Global Core was coming tonight. But not for Brandon. He was coming for me. You see, the firm I founded, Summit & Slate, isn't some local accounting shop. It's a multinational acquisition company. We don't just help with payroll, we buy companies. And last week we finalized our biggest acquisition yet, Global Core, the very company Brandon works for. And tonight their CEO is walking into this party, into this very house, to thank me for making the transition seamless. They think I came here for eggnog, but I came to change everything. If you've ever stood quietly in a room full of people who underestimated you, who looked right through you while cheering someone else on this story, is for you. Because I didn't get here by yelling. I didn't get here by demanding attention. I got here by building in silence. And tonight, silence walks in wearing heels and owns the room. Every December, the Morrison house turned into a scene straight out of a Hallmark movie. White lights wrapped around the pillars, cinnamon candles burning in every corner, and our mother's silver and red color scheme draped across the tree like a curated catalog spread. The party always drew a full house cousins from out-of-state neighbors who'd known us since kindergarten, and our father's business partners, who came mostly for the bourbon and networking. For as long as I could remember, Brandon was the star of the show. Every year, there was a new success to celebrate: his early admission to Princeton, his summer internship at a tech giant, his first job, his first Tesla. He always stood near the fireplace, like it was a stage, while our mother beamed at him, like she'd personally crafted his resume. And me, I'd be in the corner, sometimes helping in the kitchen, sometimes clearing empty glasses no one asked me to pick up, always invisible. I used to think they didn't mean to overlook me, that maybe they were just caught up in the noise of celebration. But year after year, as the spotlight never once shifted in my direction, I realized something harder to accept: they didn't forget to ask about me. They chose not to. Because in their eyes, I was the one who had stepped off track. I wasn't the Ivy League star or the rising corporate prodigy. I was the girl who quit her stable job to start something weird, as Brandon once said. No title, no office tower, no stock options to flash around, just Elena and her little business. But cold shoulders have a way of teaching you to build warmth on your own. Eventually, I stopped waiting for a seat at their table. I started building something of my own, quietly, steadily, and far away from the golden glow of family praise. And while they measured success in titles and Instagrammable milestones, I started defining it differently: by impact, by ownership, by the freedom to decide my own worth. They never noticed. Until one Christmas, the door opened and everything changed. The phrase, "your little shop," became a sort of family tradition. It always came laced with condescension, polite rehearsed, and sharp as cut glass. At first, I tried to explain. It's not a shop. It's a consulting firm, I'd say, but they'd already moved on to Brandon's new promotion or his latest tech gadget. Over time, I stopped correcting them, not because it was true, but because I learned the difference between what people say to understand you and what they say to dismiss you. The Truth Summit and Slate started in my spare bedroom, yes, beside a wobbly IKEA desk and a printer that jammed every other day. But that little shop had grown into something serious. By the time my brother was bragging about managing one department at Global Core, I was managing client portfolios in 4 countries. We helped struggling companies restructure, rebrand, and when necessary, rebuild completely. We didn't sell products, we saved futures, but my family never asked. Not once. I used to feel hurt by their disinterest, But somewhere along the way, I realized validation doesn't have to come from those who refuse to see you clearly. When you build something meaningful, you don't need applause. You need focus. Of course, they only saw office parks and boardrooms as symbols of real success. If it didn't come with a nameplate and a penthouse view, it wasn't worth noticing. So I let them underestimate me. I let them laugh. And I worked. In silence, I built something they couldn't ignore forever. They just didn't know that soon the very company Brandon worked for, the one he couldn't stop bragging about, was about to become mine. Brandon was born with charm and timing. He always knew when to flash a smile, when to speak up in front of the right people, and when to take credit, even if the idea wasn't fully his. From the outside, he looked like the perfect son honor roll student team captain, polished in suits before he was old enough to rent a car. Our parents ate it up. At every holiday gathering, they'd gush over his latest accomplishments. Even when I launched my business, the only comment I heard was, "You should talk to Brandon, he could help you make it more professional." Brandon wasn't cruel. Not in the way villains are written in books. His weapons were subtler raised eyebrows, well-timed jokes, and silence when it mattered most. Once, after I closed a multi-million-dollar contract with a logistics firm, I told my parents during brunch. My mom smiled politely and asked if I still had time to bake for the church event. Brandon, without missing a beat, said, "Guess you're the breadwinner and the baker." Everyone laughed. But here's the thing: sometimes, when the spotlight shines too long on one person, it blinds everyone else. Brandon's confidence wasn't always backed by competence. He was good, but not as invincible as he believed. And because no one ever questioned him, he never learned to grow. He mistook applause for invincibility. That's the golden lie of being the favorite. You think the world will always clap. And when the applause stops, you don't know who you are anymore. I didn't plan to teach him that lesson. But fate has a funny way of handing you the mic when no one expects you to speak. From the outside, Summit and Slate still looked like a boutique firm, intentionally so. No flashy ads, no sprawling skyscrapers with our name stamped in glass, just quiet results and steady growth. We didn't chase headlines, we chased leverage, and over time, we built it. Deal by deal, relationship by relationship. I'd learned early that real power doesn't always look like power. Sometimes it looks like silence in a boardroom while everyone else is still speaking. The first big win came 3 years ago. A regional logistics company hemorrhaging cash, desperate to stay afloat. We saw the potential, restructured their leadership, cut inefficiencies, and turned a $9 million loss into a $14 million surplus in under a year. That deal opened the door to others: a troubled chain of specialty clinics, a data center on the brink of collapse, a family-run appliance brand struggling to modernize. Each time we stepped in, quietly fixed the foundation, and walked out with equity and respect. My team handpicked, brilliant, loyal. We operated like a strike force, in and out, strategic, focused, and we never needed applause. We just needed results. I never told my family about any of it, not because I was hiding, but because I knew they wouldn't listen, and because I didn't need their approval to make moves that would eventually turn their Golden Boys company into one of my most meaningful acquisitions. They thought I still did payroll. They didn't know that last month I signed off on the purchase agreement for Global Core, the very company Brandon swore he'd soon lead. And the ink had barely dried before I received an RSVP for the Morrison Christmas party. Perfect timing. The Christmas table was already full when I arrived. Of course it was. Every seat labeled, every conversation already flowing. My name card was at the corner next to the kids' end, sandwiched between my cousin's teenage son and a neighbor's daughter who was studying early childhood education. I smiled and sat down without a word. Old habits. You learn over time not to flinch, not when the slight is that subtle, that practiced. I didn't need to ask why they put me there. I already knew I wasn't seen as someone worth centering. Brandon, on the other hand, was holding court near the fireplace again, his usual spot. He was laughing about quarterly growth, about how he'd restructure Global Core's entire West Coast division once the merger finalized. He spoke with the ease of someone who believed the future was already his. Mom watched him with the same glint in her eyes she always had. Dad nodded along, offering affirmations like punctuation marks. No one interrupted. No one questioned. At one point, Brandon looked over and raised his glass toward me. "Still running that shop, sis?" he called out with a grin. "You know, if you want something real, I could put in a word for you. Stable salary, full benefits." There it was, the seat they were offering under his shadow. And that's when it clicked. I was never meant to have a seat at their table. I was meant to inherit a table of my own. I didn't come for their invitations anymore. I came because something better was walking through the front door in exactly 7 minutes. The moment George Ellison walked through the door, time shifted. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. Even Brandon stood taller, smoothing his jacket like he was preparing for a promotion ceremony. Everyone, he announced grandly, "This is George Ellison, CEO of Global Core and soon-to-be family if this merger goes the way I expect." People clapped politely. Mom looked ready to faint with pride. But George didn't smile back at Brandon. Instead, he scanned the room once, twice, and then walked right past him. "Miss Carter," he said, holding out his hand, "thank you again for making this transition seamless. I'm honored to finally meet you in person." The room froze. Brandon's mouth opened, but no words came. Mom dropped her napkin. Someone actually gasped. "That's my sister," Brandon stammered. She runs a small consulting thing. She does taxes." George blinked, confused. "Elena Carter, CEO of Summit and Slate." Then gently, like explaining to a child, "She's the one who acquired Global Core last week. She owns majority interest. Technically, she owns you." I didn't gloat. I just smiled and set down my glass. "Brandon," I said softly, "can we talk in your office?" He followed me without a word, his posture stiff with disbelief. The hallway felt longer than usual. He didn't say anything until the door clicked shut. "Then how long have you been planning this?" And I answered truthfully, long enough to know I didn't need your approval to make it happen. Because that's the thing about building quietly, you're free to rise without asking for permission. And by the time they realize you've outgrown their expectations, it's already too late. But Brandon still had more to learn, and I had come prepared to teach him. Brandon sat across from me in his leather chair, once a symbol of status, now a seat of reckoning. He kept blinking like he was trying to wake up from a bad dream. "You can't just take over," he said, voice cracking. "I've been at Global Core for 8 years. I earned my spot. I'm about to be director." I gently opened the folder I'd brought, placing it between us. "That's why I'd like to talk about your performance reviews." His eyes flicked to the papers. Color drained from his face. He knew what was inside: missed deadlines, inflated projections, unnecessary budget risks. The kind of red flags that don't show up at family dinners but scream loudly in a boardroom. "You've been running on confidence," I said, "but not consistency. Leadership isn't just about vision. It's about execution and accountability." He leaned back stunned. "You're firing me!" "No," I replied calmly. "I'm giving you a choice, a lateral move to our Minneapolis office. No promotion, same pay, or resign with severance." To Brandon, this wasn't just professional, it was personal. But here's the thing, families give unspoken performance reviews too. They judge based on what you look like at the table, not who you are when no one's watching. And for years, mine had ranked me dead last, based on assumptions, not merit. But in business, results speak. And for once, I wasn't the one being reviewed. Still, this wasn't about revenge. It was about redefining the rules. And soon, the rest of the family would face their own reckoning. When I stepped out of Brandon's office and back into the living room, the air felt different, thicker, quieter. Conversations had hushed glances stolen in my direction, like I'd become someone entirely new. My parents were huddled with Aunt Lydia and Uncle Ron near the tree. As I walked past, the circle broke apart. My mother rushed toward me with a nervous smile. "Elena, sweetheart," she said, reaching for my arm. "Why didn't you ever tell us? We had no idea what you've built. It's incredible." I stepped back gently but firmly. "Would it have mattered?" She blinked. "Of course, we're your family." "That's just it," I replied. "Family shows up before the proof, not after the headline." For years, they had watched me from a distance, not as supporters, but as spectators. Quick to judge, slow to ask. Quick to celebrate Brandon, hesitant to even ask me how my day was. And now that my success was undeniable now, they were eager to stand beside me, not as family, but as witnesses to something impressive. But loyalty isn't about showing up for the victory lap. It's about standing with someone when the outcome is still uncertain. That night, I realized something I wish I'd understood sooner. Blood makes us related, but belief, that's what makes us family. And the ones who never truly believed in me, they no longer got to claim a seat in my corner. I smiled politely, excused myself, and gathered my coat. There was one more legacy left to close. 3 months after that Christmas party, my phone buzzed with a final confirmation. Morrison Technologies, my father's once prized engineering firm, had officially changed ownership. We'd been negotiating quietly for months long before the Global Core deal. I never told anyone. Not because I was hiding it, but because this wasn't about showmanship. It was about closure. For decades, my father had dreamed that Brandon would one day take over the business carrying the Morrison name into the next generation. But the truth was, Brandon had no interest in the company. He'd always looked down on it, called it old school, and too small time for his career plans. Still, my father clung to the hope that his son would take the reins. Instead, his daughter bought it, not for revenge, but to preserve what still had value and to prove that legacy isn't about inheritance. It's about stewardship. Legacy isn't what you leave behind in a will. It's what you build when no one's watching. It's the trust you earn, the people you mentor, the integrity you protect, even when no one thanks you for it. I had my assistant send a simple memo to my parents the following week. Subject change of ownership Morrison Technologies. Signed Elena Carter, CEO, Summit and Slate. There was no press release, no party, just a quiet moment in my office watching a name change from father to daughter, not out of rebellion, but out of vision. And with that, there was only one chapter left to close. Not a company this time, but a story. Mine. I sat at my desk that morning, same desk, same view, same cup of tea I always had. Nothing looked different, and yet everything had changed. 2 companies now bore my signature. 2 stories closed not with slamming doors or fireworks, but with a steady click of a pen. My inbox was full messages from former classmates, distant relatives, even old managers who once called me too quiet for leadership. Most began the same way: I always knew you were special. I didn't respond. Because silence, when it's rooted in purpose, doesn't need to explain itself afterward. There was no grand announcement, no viral post, just a small envelope I wrote myself, addressed to no one in particular, and slipped into my drawer. On it, I wrote 5 words that once felt like an insult, but now felt like a crown. From the desk of the tiny shop owner, what they once mocked had become the foundation of an empire, and what I once wished to prove, I no longer needed to. The real win wasn't in the boardroom or even in the ownership titles. It was in the clarity I found knowing my worth didn't require anyone else's validation, that I could lead, build, and succeed without applause, that I didn't need to shout, because sometimes the loudest triumphs are whispered, and those who once doubted you, they'll hear it anyway. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever sat at the edge of a room wondering when they'd finally see you, if your silence has ever been mistaken for weakness, then this story is yours too. And now I want to hear your voice. Tell me below, what's one thing you've quietly built without applause, without recognition, just pure resilience? Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we don't tell out loud. Until now, if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder. Your worth isn't proven by who notices you. It's proven by what you keep building anyway. And remember, you don't need to sit at their table. You can build your own. See you in the next story.